in the global political order of sorts, specifically a focus on the rise of right-wing politics internationally, the rise of right-wing politics locally, and how all of these things interact with each other. We have two fantastic speakers who will be giving their inputs today. The way it will function is that we're going to let our first speaker speak first for about 15 minutes. And because of time constraints, we'll open it up for everyone to ask some questions. And I'll manage that process when we get there. And then we'll take in our next presenter for the second half of today's program. I guess, Prof. Habib, I can say that we're friends now, old friends of sorts. So today we have with us Professor Adam Habib, and I think they should be the due respect of reading out the profiles of our speakers. Professor Habib is the Vice Chancellor and formerly Director of SOAS at the University of London. And prior to this, he was the Principal and Vice Chancellor of the University of Witwatersrand between 2013 and 2020. He served as a Deputy Vice Chancellor of Research at the University of Johannesburg, Professor of Development at the University of KZN, and as a Professor of Political Science, Professor Habib has over 30 years of academic research and administration expertise, spanning 5 universities and multiple local and international institutions. His professional involvement in institutions has always been defined by 3 distinct engagements: the contest of ideas, their translation into actionable initiatives, and the building of institutions. Professor Habib, I am super grateful to have you here with us. It's always exciting. Our country, as I said, is in interesting times. We thought the coalition government would be the curveball that we have to deal with for the next 5 years. And lo and behold, global politics does not miss us in any particular way. So welcome. And I would like to give you 15 minutes to kind of give us your thoughts about the effects of right-wing political movements, Donald Trump, Elon Musk, as well as what this global right-wing agenda looks like and its consequences for South Africa. Thank you so much.
Firstly, thank you, Dr. Chikane. Friends, colleagues, thank you for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be here and to have the ability to share my thoughts. What I thought I would do is, my apologies that I have to leave after the 35 minutes. I do have another engagement across the city, but I thought it important to be part of this event. It is an important event. And so I wanted to take this opportunity. I thought I'll do 2 quick things. In 2 or 3 minutes, say a little bit about what is happening globally with the shift to the far right. And then hone in on the South African debate, its implications for South Africa, and how I think South Africa needs to think through these issues as it navigates what is going to emerge a very complex and hostile environment. Is there a global shift to the right? The answer is yes, it's obvious. We've known that there's a shift to the right, but I would argue that there's a shift to the far right. And that's not only manifesting in the United States with the emergence of the MAGA movement. Clearly the far right within the Republicans have taken power, but it's also true of what's happening in most of Western Europe. The AFD just got less than 20%, second largest party in Germany. You're looking at the far right in France being at least in the mid-40s and probably taking command. You've got right-wing parties in Italy and many other parts of Western Europe. I think the only country standing against the grain is Spain in Europe, and I'm not so sure how long they're going to last. Most of my colleagues in Spain say to me, it's only a matter of time. How do we explain this? Well, I think that there's 3 sets of issues. I think the first is deep, deep inequalities that have become evident and grown in the last 20 to 30 years across the world as a result of what is an elite form of globalization. We've known about this, and many people wrote about this in the late 1990s, early 2000s. What we also said that would do is politically polarize societies. That's the really big danger of inequality growth is it polarizes societies. And as societies polarize, they look for explanations for their difficult circumstances. And what that has done is the search for the other in most of the Western world. And of course, migrants have become the focus of that attention. As migration has increased as a resulting part of globalization, they've become the focus of the attacks, as you've seen over the last couple of years. And then thirdly, the culture wars. And here I do think that part of this is the manipulation of the right, but I also think that the left have much to answer for, partly because they've increasingly become strident and accusatory, less focused on consciousness raising. And as they became more strident and accusatory, they've alienated people. If you look at some of the research done on social media, 73% of the people attacked by the far left in places like Twitter are liberals, not far-right people. And it does show you that they've created an alienation of significant swaths of society, which the far right has mobilized on. So that, if you like, is the backdrop to understanding the global shift to the right, why culture wars has become an issue, why migrancy has become an issue, and how you see those coupled with all kinds of suggestions around economic inclusion and economic interventions. So that's the first thing I wanted to speak about. I now want to shift, however, to Trump's executive orders and the focus on South Africa. Clearly, South Africa has been the focus over the last couple of months, partly because of South Africa has never been a quiet member of the Western Alliance. It's ruffled feathers on many, many occasions. It has and remains in contact with China, Russia, with BRICS, and it has been committed openly to the transformation of the global order. And that has made at least those, even in the Republican Party in the US and in other parts of Western Europe, quite uncomfortable. The legal case taken against Israel around the Gaza war or the Gaza attacks has really ruffled feathers, not only in Israel, but in the United States and in many Western quarters, partly because it called out the hypocrisy of the Western world when 50,000 people have been massacred in Gaza and they didn't take a stand against it. Not only that, but that they actually actively supported some of the interventions there. But it's also worth saying that there's also been a mobilization from within South Africa of the far right in the Republican Party. I remember this goes back to at least 2018 when I had an altercation with AfriForum around this issue. They were still they were on a tour trying to meet Balton then. And since then, they've continued to mobilize around land reform, etc. Trump's executive order is no doubt chauvinistic. It's no doubt racist. It's disconnected from the realities of the ground in South Africa, and it speaks to his political base in the US. Now, it seems to me AfriForum has the wish to become US refugees. They say they don't want to do this. They simply want Trump to act against certain ANC leaders. But what that shows is how disconnected they are. No nation wants people within it to appeal to a foreign government, let alone a right-wing government, to take action against their own, even if they disagree with their own citizens. Why would you want a fifth column? It is better that they leave and they go in peace. But it does raise an important issue, that the first issue that I want to raise, and that is that for the majority of the Afrikaners, I think they will stay because South Africa is their home. I would love them to stay. I think it's important that they stay because they speak to the nation we are. And I worry that they must not be on the receiving end of what is the hostile political rhetoric, which suggests that they're not part of the nation. And I've heard people speak about this. And this revolves on what I call the politics of indigeneity. The politics of indigeneity has afflicted us in South Africa. It's afflicted clearly Israel and Palestine, in India, in many, many places. And I must say, I'm going to put it strongly, it's nonsensical to focus on who's indigenous. Those who do it in South Africa or in Israel or in Europe are misguided. The human species has always wandered. We are all from everywhere. And political societies can never be built from where we come from, but from who lives together and where we are now, and what are the political arrangements to be negotiated for that. So when I hear the debate in Israel-Palestine about who was there 3,500 years ago or 4,000 years ago, I really don't care. I truly do not care whether it was Palestinians or Israelis. What it is, or it's Jewish. What worries me is who's there now, and how do we construct a socially just political set of arrangements so that all who want to live in the community can live in that community. To do otherwise is to divide and destroy us as a human community. And we should not let chauvinists, whether in South Africa, whether in the US, whether in Israel and Palestine, to define our future. And that's the first fundamental position I want to take. I think we've indulged what is I call a chauvinistic politics of indigeneity. And I think it's a nonsensical politics. And I think it goes against the grain of our constitution, and I think we need to challenge it. And so that is the first fundamental issue that I want to put on the table. The second takes me to the Expropriation Act. And the thing that worries me about the Expropriation Act is that this was a politics of symbolism rather than anything more substantive. The Expropriation Act gave the ANC government no more powers than it already had been granted in the Constitution. And, some people say to me, well, we had to pass an Expropriation Act because the last act was passed under apartheid and it was completely inappropriate for our circumstances. But we allowed this act to revolve around the politics of expropriation without compensation. And we all know that was never substantively on the cards. We all know, even now everybody is saying nobody's been expropriated without compensation. The president has gone to the US to tell people that. So why make the fuss for the last couple of years and have this entire thing revolve around this? And for the rationale for this, to be honest, from within the ANC, was the management of internal ANC battle. The EFF have always played to a politics of symbolism, a politics of indigeneity. And they've campaigned for this around the Land Act for many, many years. And it has been taken up opportunistically by MK. And so this impetus to manage this and to allow it to be crafted in the political language that it was to manage the internal politics of the ANC and the MK challenge. And frankly, it's not the first time. The ANC did this. The ANC did this with the financing of universities. And it does this with the NHS. On the financing of universities, I remember arguing as Vice Chancellor of Wits at that time, 2 members of the cabinet, that the 2017 reforms will not work. It will not resolve the financial challenges of university financing. And they, you know what was the fascinating thing is how many of them said to me, we recognize that. But we have to manage the politics of Zumba. We have to manage the politics of factions. We have to manage the politics of this. The NHS debate is nobody has to tell me that we need more investments in our public hospital, that we need to rethink the financing of our healthcare system. But in the language that it's framed, we forget that we get involved in a kind of politics of symbolism. We haven't been able to structure a serious development state. And we think we're going to manage a national health service without significant intervention. We really do need to get out of playing the politics of symbolism. Because if we don't, if we allow the chauvinists and the internal battles of the ANC to determine our development agenda, we will be paying the penalties of it. We are going to pay the penalty of this politics. The right wing is coming after us. And we need an adept agility to manage this. And it does mean we need to get away from a politics of symbolism. You can overcome historical challenges. South Korea did it, Japan did it, Taiwan and Singapore done it. We can too, but it requires a principled pragmatism. It requires addressing trade-offs. It requires taking merit seriously. And it requires looking on long-term structural development rather than short-term enrichment. And that's where the challenge for me lies. It's not that the right is coming for us or that they're being unfair. They are the far right. What did you expect them to be fair? What we should be thinking about is how do we craft a politics that can unite us, the politics that can bring the politics of social justice and structural development together, and stop allowing the internal battles of the ANC and though the politics of chauvinism to define what is in our national agenda. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you very, very much.
So thank you very much for that. I mean, you said quite a few different things, but just to remind everyone in the room around, and I'll use your wording, the kind of fundamental positions that you have, the first one being that the politics of indigeneity at times allows people to no longer think about socially just political arrangements in particular and having that type of focus. And then the other one, which I find quite interesting as well, especially in this current times, is this politics of symbolism, that forever, whether they're in power or not, are forever beholden to the internal dynamics of political parties, in particular the liberation parties such as the ANC, who are trying to showcase what they believe, but the actions don't necessarily speak to it, and the unintended and intended consequences of that. What I would like to do is open it up for questions. We don't have too much time, and hopefully maybe we can steal your time a bit, Professor Habib. If you can just raise your hand, you can also feel free to use the chat. I know some people aren't in a position to switch on their cameras or speak, but if you can put your questions in the chat, I am sure there's also the ability, and Zinzi, you'll guide me here, if people want to say their question out loud. But in the meantime, as we wait for questions, Professor Habib, I mean, I'd like to ask this question. In a world in which the far right is trying to create an other and an enemy of the other, the traditional tactic of the far right, how do you then move away from this politics of indigeneity, right? There is this tension of someone wants to use identity, wants to use the idea of they belong. So the Republican Party and the idea of the great replacement, the fear that America could become majority people of color, creates this fear, such as things such as Project 25. How do you combat that? What do these social arrangements look like, or political arrangements look like? Not just globally, but in South Africa as we deal with the consequences.
So it seems to me that the first part of this is not to indulge a politics of indigeneity. To be able to say that we are committed to a project of bringing together everybody residing in a certain geographic space to be able to live there, to recognize that the history of humanity is one of conquest on the one hand and struggles for liberation on the other. And the consequence of that is many of us have, none of us are really indigenous to where we are. Very few of us are pure. Very few of us are truly entirely indigenous to one place. Think about where this is emerging from the United States. And the very people who live in the United States, the very people of the far right are not indigenous to that geographic space of land. And so what we should be articulating is a politics that animates our constitution, which is we all belong here because this is where we are. And what we need to do is establish a set of socially just, and I want to underscore socially just political arrangements that brings us here together. That's what this is about. And that's what we need to start articulating. Now, by the way, our constitution captures this. All of our legislation captures this. There are some elements of tension sometimes in the way we pursue the transformation agenda. And if you look at the transformation agenda, the legislation of it is actually quite good. It's sometimes the practice of it that violates this principle. But it also means that from those within our ranks who raise this politics of indigeneity repeatedly to other citizens of our nation, we need to hold them to account. We can't indulge it. We can't partner it. We need to call it out. And that, for me, then gives confidence to a really non-racial project of cosmopolitanism. That's the alternative, it seems to me, in this agenda. And by the way, it's not only the West. Think about India and Hindutva and Modi and the Modi agenda. We need to construct a global politics. And that starts off by ensuring that we practice the politics that we preach.
Yeah. And I'll ask one last pushback, just a little bit, and also give you two other questions that are in the chat because they're rolling in. I think it's fair to ask, because you had used Palestine and Israel, and I think it's a good example of it is fine to ask for socially just arrangements, but some people have bigger guns, right? And some people are not afraid of committing genocide. And how do you avenge that, especially with a country like America and Israel in particular, but America has shifted in particular. And then there's two questions in the chat. There's quite a few, but if I'll highlight these first two first. So there's one from David Kenyon and Kenvin, who asked, how should we react to the news that Trump has ended all US aid to HIV organizations in South Africa? And then we have another question from Wasim Reep. How will the administration address the potential negative impact of these cuts on public perception and trust in the government? I think you can kind of put those two together, if you don't mind. And then if I pose one last one from our chairperson, Reverend Marcin Clark, is it adequate to exclude the contribution of the crisis of capitalism in wrapping our minds around the rise of the far right? And let me leave it there, and then I'll take the comment with the raised hand afterwards.
Okay, so I'm going to start with the crisis of capitalism, Moss's question. I started off by saying, I think all of this has its roots in inequality. And it's a global form of financial capitalism. And that global form of financial capitalism has dramatically accelerated inequality the world over, but quite dramatically in multiple places. And it's that and the effects of political polarization that flow from that. So in a sense, if you think that the politics of migration is really the symptom, the manipulation by the far right of what is a deep structural divide. And so I started with that, and I think that in the long term, the real debate is how do we change that? And by the way, I don't think it's going to change most by some great revolution. I think it's going to require a series of structural interventions that subverts it from within. And that's something that I think we politically need to think through. Everybody talks about Gramsci. I think very few people really truly understand what's a Gramscian project in this contemporary era. I'll return to this, to your question in a minute. The second thing is USAID's cuts. I think it's, on the one hand, I'm not surprised because they're using levers that they have to get compliant political behavior. Now, the problem is twofold. One is, how did we allow ourselves to become so dependent on our HIV/AIDS programs, become so dependent on external political actors? So is there something? That's the fundamental question. And we're going to have to work around it, that we never as dependent on those issues again. And for me, the first element of that is we're going to have to start finding resources from within. How we do that, how we structure that, and how can we do and bring the nation together in a collective project that is something that we should think about. The second is we need to mobilize resources from alternative quarters that are more open. So the Scandinavians, possibly from China and Japan and East Asia. On the local, I imagine if we went to South Africans, both rich and poor, like we did under COVID, and say, we want to create a collective project managed by civil society or managed by somebody that has trust to actually move cash into programs that make up for these deficits, get capital behind it. That becomes a project of unification for social justice. That's the kind of imagination. And then the final thing that I want to ask, how do you deal with big guns? Well, the challenge with dealing with big guns when you have small guns is not to think you're going to go and win this fight. It's all very nice to be macho. The real thing is, how do you think strategically? And this is where I think South Africa has been the most strategic. I mean, I was pleasantly surprised at the tactics of South Africa at the ICJ. They effectively went in, took the global infrastructure and used it for an alternative agenda. And in the process, enabled the mobilization of the global community into that project. That is what I call using structures. It's for subversion for progressive outcomes. If you like, I used to write about foreign policy, and I used to say the thing that intrigued me about Mbeki was his focus on using the global infrastructures to subvert it for alternative agendas. It's a kind of strategic intervention. It goes back to the best traditions of our liberation movement. And it seems to me that that is what we should be thinking about. Is, people are going to not like what I say here, but what I think Hamas did as a result of October 7th is they enabled the Israeli right to set back Israel-Palestine to pre-1992, pre-Oslo, to go back to effectively a traditional project of occupation. That's what they've done. And in a sense, what you've done is you've completely transformed the entire Middle East to what is a conservative agenda. His basically Hamas is decimated. Hezbollah is on the attack. Iran is on the retreat. Half of Syria has collapsed. There's a whole new reimagination of the Middle East that is happening. And while I was not friends with all of the people, I don't think that the outcome of this is going to be positive. I think it's going to be very, very negative for poor and marginalized people, and for, in particular, the Palestinian struggle. And that is the question that you should ask, is look at what Hamas did, look what South Africa's engagement around the ICJ is. From a political strategy point of view, those were two very distinctive pathways. The latter is more clever than the former, because when you go against big guns and you don't have them, you will pay the consequences. I can't hear you.
Sorry, didn't realize I'd muted myself. I know your time is running out, but we have one hand that's up. So non-Kubena, Maliza, if you don't mind unmuting yourself. Now, you know, usually when I chair meetings in person, I can look intimidating to the person who's asking the question, but I can't do it online. So non-Kubena, if you don't mind keeping the question short and sweet as well. Thank you.
I'm going to try. Can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
Thank you. Thank you, Prof. So, I mean, my question is, I mean, it's a complex issue, and I think I'm just battling still to understand this global move to the far right. So, because for me, you speak about the deep inequality that is one of the causes, but for me, it seems to benefit mostly the elites, you know, certainly in America, and you know, there's an old, well, it's not old, a sociological philosophy that says that when resources are scarce, then people tend to divide along identity lines. I mean, it's also, what's that book, that old book that we all read in school? That's what it's about. But, and I understand, and I mean, and for me, this is what explains what people often called, you know, what's the word I'm looking for? In South Africa, what they call, what do we say, you know, issue in other countries is immigration, whatever, but what happens in townships, it's for me, the lack, when resources are scarce, people divide along identity lines. That's what happens, and then we can call it whatever we call it. But in America and in Germany or whatever, I don't this shift, this, you know, dramatic, and even in France, dramatic shift, you know, to the far right, I still battle to understand it. But Prof. Habib, to me, when there's an issue, you say, and I agree with you, in terms of the politics of indigeneity, that they're very much backward looking and not about the present, and they're not, you know, in a sense, progressive. But for me, the reason for that is because there are still some issues around justice that have not been addressed. And so so yes, it doesn't matter who was there 1,000 years ago and who was there, but there's some basic issues of justice that do need to be addressed so that we can move forward in an equitable, I mean, I don't know if we can call it fair way. And so because there's been no justice, this is what remains. I mean, yeah, I'm going to start rambling, but this is what I'm saying. Let me pause there. If I don't know if it made any sense at all.
No, you did. And it seems to me that there are two elements to that. One is trying to understand why is it that the politics of the other has become so dominant in places like the United States, and whether the United States working class is richer than the South African working class. And that's true. But it's worth saying that the United States is far more unequal in 2024 than it was in 2007. And it's far more unequal than it used to be 10 or 15 or 20 years earlier. And it may be richer, but it is more unequal. The gap between the ones at the bottom and the ones in the top. And that is what the elites have manipulated for their own purposes. There is anger, there is othering, there is lots of people feeling alienated, and obviously elites, whether fascism in Germany in the 1930s or Mussolini in Italy, or many of the other contemporary examples, is elites manipulate these discontents. And it is kind of ironical that the guy who says he's going to look after poor people's interests in the United States is a billionaire Trump, and Elon Musk, who's from South Africa. I mean, Elon Musk talks about visa regimes when his own visa was in question, if you go back 30, 40 years ago. So that's the thing, that's the hypocrisy of it all. I also agree with social justice. I don't think you can address, but I don't think you can address the politics of social justice by going to indigeneity. All you'll allow is a different set of elites to monopolize the issue for their own agendas. And this is where I think we do need to make trade-offs. South Korea was unjust. So was Singapore. They did succeed, but they succeeded because they took the long-term view. They succeeded because they went for structural corrections. They succeeded because they fixed education and healthcare. They succeeded because they took merit seriously. They succeeded because they didn't play to what I call a crude politics of symbolism. That's the problem that we've got. And part of that problem emanates from our political architecture, and part of it emerges from what I call the elites, the political elites of the liberation project, who are looking to become billionaires. They want to be the new Anton Ruperts rather than really correct for the historical divides of our past. And so we need to create a politics, not of indigeneity, but a non-racial politics of social justice that speaks about addressing these structural divides. And I think they can be. And we can learn lessons from other places in the world that have done this. I'll stop there.
I mean, so thanks for that. Now, I know, again, I will keep pushing you, Prof. Habib. You know me. And there's quite a few different questions in the chat, but there's two in particular that I do want to highlight because they were directed to you based on your earlier comments. And I think it fits within this mold of your fundamental principles about political symbolism, or the politics of symbolism, as well as this idea of indigeneity and social justice, or the political arrangements. So the two questions, and I think they're important. One is from Feroza Mayat, who's just asking for this clarity, who's asking, so do you not agree with the position that SA took at the ICJ? So just clarity on that. And then from Sunny Morgan, who essentially says that you're misreading the issue around Palestine, and that this Israeli project is simply no longer viable, and that the most that Israel really did was simply make the outcome more predictable for the Palestinians, which is a point that I resonate with, this idea that we're not discussing, we're not debating. I want more predictable outcomes from authoritarianism. I'm looking for more predictable outcomes from pushing my agenda, because democracy leaves things too open for debate. So bar, as Sunny goes on to say, bar the genocide and immeasurable loss of life, the outcome in this situation might just be a secular state, which isn't necessarily the greatest social arrangement at times as well.
Yeah, so firstly, I actually think South Africa was brilliant in the ICJ case. I thought it was really, that's when the ICJ, I think it was at its best in the ICJ case, because it took and subverted, it took the international architecture that exists, and it actually reoriented it to the interests of the marginalized. That's what I think is why it was so fantastic. It didn't think it was going to win this on the battlefield because the guns were too big. So what it did is it used the global institutional architecture, used the rules, and highlighted in a magnificent way with an incredible legal team, the ability to put the case forward. And I think it not only exposed the Israeli state, it exposed the Western government's hypocrisy at it. And that's what I'm saying we should think about. And the way they did it speaks to the liberation traditions, what I call radical pragmatism. It's radical, but it was pragmatic. It understood when you had to cut the deal, when you did. This, for all of the criticism of Mandela, he understood if you want to shift, if you want to transform society, you need to divide the enemy. You need to win over people to your project. That is what this project is about. And second, I don't disagree, actually. I think it's a crazy, I think that Netanyahu's project in the long term is bound to fail. You can't kill the people into submission. The history of the world shows that. You can't destroy. You cannot do what the Australians did to the Aborigines in the modern world. It's just not possible. And so that, I think you're absolutely right. But don't tell me the strategy that was embarked upon in October 7th was to overexpose the Israeli state to murder so many people that they destroy the legitimacy of the Israeli state. That's not a rational project. What we should be thinking about is how to mobilize the global community into a project that says this doesn't have to be a mutually exclusive goal, that Israelis and Palestinians can live together, that Muslims and Jewish people and Christians can live together. And the history of the world is an example of that. We have to win people over into another project. And that means, colleagues, forcing the Israeli population to shift their position. But it also requires others to call out people within our ranks who advocate a chauvinist politics, a politics of indigeneity. That we need to also call out, because you can't indulge that exists as well. I'll stop there. Thank you. Unfortunately, I do have to go.
That is perfectly understandable, and we thank you very much for your time. We will definitely be inviting you to more of our discussions, and maybe in person. You can run away from the winter.
Absolutely. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you so much.
Tata. Bye-bye.
So I want to use this moment. We're waiting for just one of our speakers. So originally, for those who saw the program, you would have seen that Judith February was also going to join us today. Unfortunately, she had to send her apologies because Freedom Under Law is currently dealing with an urgent case of sorts. She did want to be here. She did want to give her views on the matter, but unfortunately, she wasn't able to come. We are waiting for Prof. Olela Mangcu to come in as well. He's logging in. I assume he's in the United States now, but it gives us a really interesting opportunity to kind of democratize a space as we wait. So don't run away just as yet. There's been quite a few different comments in the chat, right? We've been talking about geopolitical politics, global politics, but there is this rise of increased prominence of right-wing or right-leaning politics in the country. For those who might have paid attention after last year's elections, the majority of parties that came into our parliament were either far-right or right-leaning, or center-right at best, with very few organizations legitimately representing the left sitting in our parliament. And that's not a mistake, right? That is a circumstance of the trajectory our country has been following. We've also been seeing the rise of xenophobic antagonism in the country. You can trace that back to 2007 in particular. And when I look at all these instances of this slow trickle effect rise, it reminds you of what happened in the United States. And as Ravi rightfully said, he asked the question of what should happen today to avoid a move to the right in SA in 10 years, and what should civil society be doing differently? And I want to ask, he's about to log on now, Sean, if he's with us now, within this context of like this rising rights, Neeshan Balton, who's the executive director of AKF and part of DOD, gave a really interesting comment on Newsroom Africa about this idea of Project 2025 and this notion of how it links back to what AfriForum is doing and kind of canvassing views of the country. So, Sean, I know you've just come on, and we thought we'd bring you in to just give us your views around this idea of Project 2025, the actions of AfriForum, and what that means for South Africa in general, and what it means in the context of the rising rights in our country, or the resurgence. Let me not say rise, but the resurgence. And then after, hopefully, Prof. Mangcu will be with us.
No, thanks, Rukhotsafet. Can you hear me?
Loud and clear.
No, thank you very much. I think one of the mistakes that people make is thinking that Trump is just an erratic person without a plan. That might have been in his first term. Him coming into office now is on the basis of a well thought out 900-page manifesto, which is really his plan to govern, was written up by some organization called the Heritage Foundation, supported by 100 other right-wing think tanks across the US, and obviously supported by the billionaires and so forth in the US. And this plan essentially is what Trump is executing. At the heart of it is about reshaping and repurposing the US state to make it as small as possible, to create as much space for the tech companies to take over particular functions, and for business to take over much of the functions of government, to cut it down in size in the most dramatic fashion, and to take away, defund the services that would fund primarily the poor. Secondly, is waging a war against all of the progress made in terms of the civil rights movement and so forth. And those are being eroded in the name of fighting against what they call DEI. And is really a whole program to almost bring back segregation into the US, not using that same term, but almost now questioning the ability of Black people to do all kinds of work. You saw it with the Joint Chief of Staff, and you're seeing it across. At political level, is changing the electoral requirements so that it makes it even harder for Black people there to participate and to register. At the global level, is an alignment of right-wing groups that has come across in the last decade or more with far greater coherence in terms of their ideology and their tactics. At the heart of their tactics is really to use democracy to subvert democracy. Once they get into office, is to destroy the institutions of democracy and to almost rule like autocrats, and in the process, almost become autocratic rulers that will go unchallenged. The judiciary will go, all of the other institutions that have checks and balances. It's state capture at a much grander scale than we have ever imagined. The alignment ideologically between Trump and AfriForum finds its roots in their supremacist thinking. And AfriForum now goes there because they have somebody that they think can use pressure on the South African government to, in a sense, enhance their own narrow-minded, isolationist, and in some ways segregationist thinking here. So there's ideological alignment that you're finding between AfriForum and Trump. And you've seen their crazy memorandum that they've handed over there, calling themselves a Western, the last sort of bastion of Western civilization at the tip of Africa. And it's in that context, we must, however, not see AfriForum as representative of Afrikaners, or as complete representatives of Afrikaners. I think we would be making a mistake to do that. It is, however, incumbent, and it's unfortunate that we have to do this, but it's also incumbent on white South Africans and specifically Afrikaners to now come out and say that AfriForum doesn't speak for them, but in significant numbers. They have to refute the legitimacy that AfriForum have now claimed for themselves and have used that to position themselves in the US. That's what we have to do. Secondly, we have to begin to take our own counter-narrative to the US and to the South African public, that I think the falsehoods that AfriForum and others have been peddling here and abroad needs to be challenged, and needs to be challenged much, much more consistently than we've done. I think dismissing this as we have done thus far doesn't do us any good, because as you've seen, you can repeat lies, and those lies becomes internalized by large sections of the population without us beginning to challenge it. I think lastly, when I talk to people in the US, the degree of fear, the degree of paralysis is almost as if they were in their own state of emergency. It might be worth our while to extend solidarity to activists and Democrats in the US, as was extended to us in the 1980s and early 1990s. Let me leave it there, Khotsepetse.
Well, thanks so much for that. And it really, and I see Prof. Mangcu has come in. It really helps kind of understand, Prof. Mangcu, so far we've been talking about this global effect of right-wing populism. We had Professor Habib come in before, who kind of stated two particular arguments about he's cautioning around the rise of far-right populism. One is the politics of symbolism, so political parties who are trying to put in policies to appease, but it creates unintended consequences that gives the far-right ammunition, essentially, in the context of AfriForum in South Africa. And the other one is that the politics of indigeneity gets in the way of social justice and political arrangements. And I won't repeat his entire argument, but for you, I want to bring you into the chat. And for those who don't know Professor Mangcu, I haven't seen you in many years, Prof. But I'm really glad to see you again.
Good to see you.
Professor Mangcu is a professor of sociology and history at George Washington University. He was previously a professor of sociology at the University of Cape Town between 2012 and 2017. He's had a plenitude of fellowships from Harvard University, MIT, the Brookings Institute, the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, the Rockefeller Foundation, and the Institute of Commonwealth Studies at the University of London. There's a lot more you can say here, but I want to highlight particular things from Prof. Mangcu, that he is the author of one of my favorite books called Biko Alive, which won UCT's Meritus Award. He's also going to become, I believe, he's going to create the first African authored biography of Nelson Mandela, which we expect to come out in 2026. And after that, we'll then write a biography on Archbishop Desmond Tutu. So we welcome you into this room, Prof. You are the most prolific political intellectual in South Africa, to get your thoughts. And if we can also ground it about, because a lot of the people in the room are in South Africa, activists in the country, about what should civil society, ordinary South Africans be thinking about when it comes to the rise of the right internationally and the consequences that has for us here, and how we should be mobilizing or thinking about challenging this discourse. We thought we'd give you about 15 minutes so we can let everyone else come and grind you afterwards.
That's a long time. And by the way, I'm sure there would be people who would quibble with the most prolific thing, public intellectual thing. Look, we are veterans, I suppose, as South Africans in dealing with right-wing, white nationalist politics. In fact, as I speak now, the Americans seem to be taking a leaf from one of our strategies in South Africa, there's an economic boycott here in the US of all major retailers. You know, it takes me to the consumer boycott strategies of the 1980s. And there is indeed, I mean, quite a great deal that can be learned. In fact, I just finished writing an op-ed article for one of our newspapers in South Africa. Hopefully they'll publish it, drawing some parallels between Trump and P.W. Botha. I know there have been comparisons to people like Hitler and Mussolini and all of that, but I find the Botha parallel quite instructive. The idea of somebody who presides over this far-flung empire, right, but also seeks to, I mean, the thing about right-wing nationalism, right, is that it's getting fire. It's fire lit. It's been there on the surface, but when the United States, the most powerful country in the world, embraces it so publicly, it becomes something uniquely dangerous, let's just say. What can civil society do? I'll disagree, albeit very slightly, with the idea that Americans have kind of like acting like they are defeated or something along those lines. What's interesting, and this has some relevance to the Botha parallel I'm making, all coalitions, even the most indomitable coalitions, tend to implode from inside. And there was a point where Botha seemed like untouchable. But over time, that coalition began to fray at the edges because of a whole series of contradictions within the coalition itself. And that's what's beginning to happen in the United States right now, is that these government actions, right, are affecting Trump's supporters themselves, right? Because at the heart of the Trump coalition, basically you have the blue-collar working class support, and you have got the tech billionaires. But everything that is being done now is being driven by the tech billionaires to the detriment of the blue-collar supporters. So what you are seeing now, actually, in the states and in counties around the country, are all these town halls that are being disrupted. And they're being disrupted by Republicans themselves. I'm being asked to admit somebody. Am I supposed to do that?
No, you do not have to do that. Our team will have it.
Right. So what's beginning to happen is that, right, there are all these protests in the states, and there are protests in Washington, D.C. almost on a daily basis. And right, but obviously American civil society is not as, shall we say, well organized and as our civil society was. And this is the danger, actually, that the Democratic Party doesn't seem to have found a leader and a vision to kind of push against this. My bet is that, and I could be naive in this, but my bet is that this is going to fall on its face. Not because Americans are not racist and the people who support Trump are not racist, but because it's going to hit closer home in terms of its effects. Now, in terms of how we South Africans enter this field, number one, having said all that I did and keeping in mind all that I just said, number one is that it's important that we keep the long term in view. We keep the mid to long term in view. Yes, all of this is happening, but Trump is not going to be around forever. I do not believe that we are going to have in the United States an autocratic dictatorship that follows, that lasts beyond, the next 3 years, unless, of course, Trump reinstalls himself, against the limitations that he can no longer have another term. But I don't see that working. So, from a South African perspective, I would agree that we need to shape American public opinion, right? I don't think that, quite frankly, and that could well be because I'm sitting on this side, but I don't hear AfriForum. I don't read about AfriForum here. I don't think they're having a presence in this country. If one is to juxtapose that to American public policy and discourse. So it seems to me that the more important thing to do is for us as South Africans to inject our history, to inject our examples against white racist nationalism into the American public domain, to, as a previous speaker was saying, to refute these notions and these lies that Trump has been spewing. And I think we would have an audience. The problem we have, and I've said this for many, many years, is that South Africa simply does not have a presence in the United States. I think our public diplomacy is horrendous. It's just like terrible. We don't have a presence in this country. You hardly read a newspaper article by a South African about South Africa and about what's happening in South Africa. Our diplomats, our ambassadors have just failed miserably on this score. And that is why it is easy for organizations like AfriForum to penetrate and leave that image out there, because we just don't have the kind of public diplomacy. And that public diplomacy, of course, right, would have to work not only with our government, but with South African civil society. Just bring South African civil society's voices to bear on American public discourse. I don't know why this country, our government, finds that so hard to do. Because we have so much to share, we have so much credibility. What we did, for example, in the case of Israel, right? That is what we are supposed to do, to bring our profile, to bring our moral capital, at least, to the extent that it is still there to bear. And there are some questions about that. But we can talk about our history, and bring that history into life in the United States. I think I'll leave it at that.
Yeah, no, thanks so much for that. And again, I'll leave it for the chat. So for those who have questions for Prof. Mangcu, you can put it in the chat, or if you want to speak out loud, just raise your hand and we will unmute you at that time. But Prof, so I hear your point around civil society really trying to put their voice into the United States, to use this language of, we used to be the moral compass of the world. I think we still have a lot of capital for that. I think the ICJ case brought a lot of that capital back. But I imagine there will be a lot of civil society in South Africa who will say, but our problems are so vast here that we don't have the resources that AfriForum has to claim that they represent not just 600,000 people, but they said, Prof, yesterday that they represent 2 million Afrikaners in total, who don't have the resources, who don't necessarily have the money, but face the direct consequences of these actions. to ask civil society to say, how do you then impose your voice there? Once you're putting out fires in your own country. What would you say about that type of response?
We have public intellectuals, right? I mean, you write an op-ed for the New York Times, right? It just reaches so many people that what AfriForum may want to do or say, right, it is just going to lag. You know, all I'm saying this is not even a question of money. It's a question of having your voices in the public domain. It's a question of being on television. You know, it's writing in influential public opinion journals and magazines. The last time we had this, I kid you not, the last time we had this kind of presence, actually, and that's because I was here at that time and I can remember it, was in the early 90s and the late 1980s. But it was in the early 1990s, and you had across the United States, but I was in Boston at the time, there was public voices all the time. And we're not talking about, I'm not saying, you know, people who are dealing with enormous challenges of poverty in South Africa, of all the challenges we have, should stop what they're doing. It doesn't take much to have your public voices made heard or known. And as I say, I've never seen anything. I have never seen anything by a South African voice on the op-ed pages of the New York Times or the Washington Post. And that's just a fact. And I read newspapers almost on a daily basis.
I see you're keeping print media still alive, clearly, with the newspapers. Well, then it leads, and again, I haven't seen any hands that are coming up. I think there's a chat. You're being told that this is a very informative platform, so thank you so much for that. We've got Wasima Reep, who'd like to come in, and I really appreciate, Wasima, you've been very active in the chat, so always appreciate that. If you don't mind unmuting yourself and keeping your question brief.
Hi everyone, I hope you are doing good. What I wanted to ask was, as we know what's happening, everyone knows, it's known, it's on the news, it's on the websites, on the internet, everyone. So my question is regarding Trump's decision to appoint Musk, how can this impact public trust in the government's ability to operate fairly and transparently? Because as we know, we're not always certain that this may turn into a positive effect, for my personal opinion. It can be negative, the outcome can become worse, but I'm going to keep it sweet and short. I'm not going to talk your head into all worlds of places. So I'm going to keep it sweet and short, but that is my question. I would really just like to know, how can us as South African citizens or the public be able to trust the government and be able to trust that the government operates fairly and they operate at the right way? And another thing I wanted to add was, how can we make sure as a union or as South Africans that we should stand together and be able to not fight, but be able to protect ourselves and be able to know what we should do? Because I'm pretty sure, like I said in the chat box, that not everyone knows about it and people may not even care about what's going on. And yeah, that's my question.
Thank you so much.
Well, maybe they should appoint a public diplomacy, set up a public diplomacy office in the embassy here in Washington, D.C. It's as simple as all that. And that person becomes the person who speaks for South Africa and invites people from South Africa to speak directly, you know, to the American people. You know, that is that can be an official, easily funded thing. I don't know why it has not crossed anybody's mind. I mean, you know, there was a series of polls that came out a few days ago, and the polls show not only Donald Trump's unpopularity. In fact, he is the least popular president at this stage of their terms ever since the polling started. He's at 47%. The disapprovals are higher than the approvals. But even more unpopular in terms of the polls is Elon Musk. The disapprovals are 50%. The disapprovals in terms of this government, freezing of jobs and firing people and all of that, is highly unpopular, in the United States. So I agree that when you get people who are unelected, right, that takes away from the legitimacy. I think, quite frankly, the Musk thing is going to backfire, and it's going to backfire terribly. I think it's beginning to backfire, actually, for Trump and the Republicans, because he's not elected.
I mean, it speaks volumes, and again, everyone feel free to add into the chat. It speaks volumes around, let's take it back to South Africa for a moment, in the political climate that we have, that you could have certain people that it feels as if the public discourse says we don't want a particular individual. It feels that the public discourse says we don't want a particular political organization. Yet, boom, when the elections come, the person that the public discourse framed as evil, as a tyrant, as corrupt, as etc., 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 becomes a popular leader in the country. Donald Trump, there's a fantastic book called Strangers in Our Own Land that talks about how Americans in the South felt like they were strangers and gave the impetus for the Tea Party and eventually Donald Trump. And in our country, bringing it back home, the label of former President Zuma as, this corrupt leader, not a man of the people, he's the face of state capture, creates a party, and in 6 months' time gets 14% of the vote and becomes the official opposition in our country. How do we reconcile these tensions within a country? How do you not get surprised when sometimes the political zeitgeist proves to be wrong?
Yeah. Well, I mean, that takes me to a little bit of an academic detour. I mean, there are two major conceptions of democracy, and this is a long-running debate. There's a conception that democracy is about elections, procedural democracy, elections, a free press, you name it, a parliament, right? The focus is on structures. And then there's the idea of substantive democracy and participatory democracy, right? Having civil society, civic education, a discussion of values, culture and all of that. And what democracy has failed, the procedural democracy, is what gives us these individuals, right? Because it all depends on the latest gimmick. It all depends on them appealing to the base instincts, right? To cruelty, anti-immigrant rhetoric, anti-gay rhetoric, right? Procedural democracy is there just as a skeleton, right? Without the flesh. And so it's easy for people to put whatever they want to put into it and elect people like Trump and you name it. We need to get back to that idea of civic democracy in all of our communities, where people actually get together and talk about things. So that when somebody issues a xenophobic slur, for example, somebody can stand up and say, no, please, you can't talk about people like that, right? But, you just have, so that we have this community-based, and it may seem far off and impossible, but history shows that it has worked when it has worked. It worked. People like Steve Biko used that kind of politics to organize people. So your question, in my view, goes to the heart of the problem with democracy as we conceive it now. To understand the emergence of people like Zuma and Trump, you have to understand that. And you have to understand that, of course, democracies have failed people in terms of their economic prospects. So growing numbers of hungry and poor and jobless people, right, will always lead to this kind of scapegoating, of other people. That's why people like that then emerge. I mean, this is what happened in Nazi Germany when they began to say, you know, the Jews are the cause of all of our problems. It's always the other people. And when you don't have a countervailing discourse, then that kind of political culture becomes dominant.
So, Prof, we have one, and it's probably have time for this last question. It's from Langalihle, who says, Prof, there's a thesis that the Trump-Musk matter and the AfriForum delegations will drive the ANC and the radical left in South Africa, including the EFF and MKP, back into each other's arms. Do you see that potential, and what could it mean for politics here over the medium and long term?
Okay, look, come on, you know, good luck with that. I mean, if you think this is going to bring those parties together, you just have no idea of what has brought them apart in the past. You know, I mean, it's you know, and it's not even substantive politics. I mean, when I look at the games that these parties play, I'm like, you know, somebody doesn't like somebody, and then they break away, and then they, you know. No, it's not going. The short answer is no. It's not going to bring those parties back together.
Yeah, which is a bit of a shame. I've always made the
Well,
argument.
you can't depend on what AfriForum does, you know, or does not do for your own unity.
So, Prof, I do want to thank you for your time. We will definitely have you back on. You posed tons of different questions around this idea of getting the South African narrative back out there. There was a narrative that came out after this AfriForum debacle where some of the right were saying that South Africa must remember that we're a small country, and that America is a big country and we don't want to be on their bad side. And it got me thinking that you're completely right, that if someone doesn't know you exist, right, you then don't mean anything to them. And there's then a responsibility on your hands to then make your existence be felt. Not let your existence be dependent on them in any particular way, but let your existence be felt. And I think that's something that civil society needs to really get right to counter this narrative that AfriForum is pushing. So, Prof, I want to say thank you so much. I also want to give a big thank you to everyone who's attended this call. We hit a nice little peak of quite a lot of people who came onto the call. I'd also like to thank Prof. Habib, who gave up some time to come speak to us, and for everyone who participated, especially the chat. I don't think I've seen a chat so active before, discussions amongst themselves and sharing resources as well. It's the type of space that we need to create substantive, I think you called it civic democracy, Prof. We might be online, but I definitely think there's a need for that. Thank you so much, everyone. Our time was supposed to end at 9:20 to allow people to go cook dinner, be with their families. If there are any questions that you want to pose to others, please send it to our team. And one last big thank you to the DoD staff who helped organize these discussions. And please be on the lookout for more discussions around contemporary issues in South Africa going forward. And please go onto our website. And if you haven't joined our organization yet, please do. I'm going to wish you all a pleasant good night and farewell. Thank you so much.